comes to gray matter, in the spinal cord or in the brain, we're considering neurons, and specifically the cell bodies. Remember the cell bodies? The cell bodies of neurons make up gray matter. And then all of their axons travel, and those axons make up white matter. And it's the myelinated axons making up white matter. And we can call those axons fibers. In the brain, we have cellular organization when it comes to white matter and gray matter, similar to the spinal cord. But the cerebrum and the cerebellum below it, behind and below it, have additional areas of gray matter. And here, we have a deep inner region of gray matter, surrounded by white matter, tracts of white matter. Tracts are groups of axons running together. And then we have a further layer of, an additional layer of gray matter, making the cortex, okay? And that's what we would touch if we were touching the brain. We would touch this outer layer of additional gray matter called the cortex, okay? And again, gray matter are neuronal cell bodies. In the central nervous system, we call groups of neuronal cell bodies nuclei. Not nuclei like the nucleus in cells, okay? But here we call groups of neuronal cell bodies of neurons that are all working towards the same goal, okay? Grouping them together, they're called nuclei. When we look at the peripheral nervous system, they're gonna be called something else, okay? They get a different name. But here, groups of neuronal cell bodies are called nuclei. And then again, their axons will travel and run together. Okay, their axons travel, and they travel in tracks. Okay, so we group axons together, and they travel in tracks. And these myelinated axons, who makes myelin in the central nervous system? What's making myelin? The myelin sheath wrapped around axons in the central nervous system. Yes, thank you so much. The oligodendrocytes, right? Well, what about the peripheral nervous system? The Schwann's. All right. Once we head down the central nervous system, leaving the cerebrum and head down into the midbrain, okay? Or excuse me, the brain stem where we find the midbrain. Eventually this, the internal gray matter, okay, is going to start to disappear, okay? The cortex, the outer gray matter starts to disappear. We still have nuclei there, central gray matter. So here we have gray and white matter. So we have gray matter, this outer cortex here is gray matter. And then we can see white matter as well, displayed here. And again, white matter are axons running. When we do a nice cross section through the brain, and we stain it, put it on a slide, and visualize it via our microscopes, we can see gray matter versus gray matter versus white matter. All right, let's start at the cerebrum. Okay, so the cerebrum is controlling thought. And it's also controlling muscle movement. Okay? Voluntary muscle movement, controlling our memory. It's divided into two hemispheres, the left and right hemisphere, where the left is controlling speech, writing, language, the right hemisphere, touch, spatial visualization. So the right and left hemispheres are controlling different functions of the body. Here we have the right and left hemispheres of the cerebrum. Below the cerebrum and posterior, we'll find the cerebellum. So Here we are, taking a lateral view of the cerebrum. The cerebrum consists of 5 different lobes that are should remind you of the parts of the skull. Right? Named for the bones of the skull. Okay? So our 5 different lobes. We have our frontal lobe, our parietal lobe, occipital, our temporal lobe, and then deep is the insula. This is a deep lobe. The frontal lobe is responsible for a conscious control of our skeletal muscle. Okay, so the frontal lobe controls skeletal muscle. And then our parietal lobe, behind the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe is where touch and pressure, pain and temperature, taste, all of those sensations are perceived here at the parietal lobe. The temporal lobe, here we are. It's all about perceiving what we're hearing, auditory, and also what we're smelling, olfaction. And then the occipital lobe is where we're receiving all of our visual information that's coming in. And then again, we have this deep lobe called the insula that's involved in emotions. This is where homeostasis is controlled, okay? Keeping our bodies at a proper internal balance across all of our different physiological variables, all controlled at the insula. That is a deep lobe. Okay, so our lobes again: frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital in the back, temporal is lateral, deep is the insula. We do a nice coronal section through the brain. We can see the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and then deep we can see the insula. We're going to come back here and learn about the cavities within the brain, the ventricles, where we'll see how cerebral spinal fluid flows through the central nervous system, bathing the tissue here, taking care of those neurons that we learned about. Okay, when it comes to the cerebrum, we can see how it's all folded up. We have these folds and these creases, right? Those are our gyri and sulci. A gyrus is this raised ridge that we see as the brain is folded, real nice and squished up. All of that neural tissue gets folded in order to fit into the cranial cavity. Okay? But in that folding, we get these raised ridges, the gyri, and these deep depressions, these shallow depressions, the sulci. We also find at the cerebrum, we have these deep grooves called fissures. Here is the longitudinal fissure. The longitudinal fissure divides the right and left hemispheres. So right down here divides the right and left hemisphere of the cerebrum. The longitudinal fissure. And then we have the transverse fissure. And transversely, horizontally, separating the cerebrum above from the cerebellum below. All right, let's look at some of our gyri and our sulci. Okay. We have an important sulcus, one that we kind of use as a landmark, the central sulcus. The central sulcus is going to separate the frontal lobe, most anterior, from the parietal lobe behind it. The central sulcus. Then we have the lateral sulcus here on the model. The lateral sulcus is going to divide both the frontal and parietal lobes from the temporal lobe below. occipital sulcus. It kind of runs between the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe, separating them. Now, besides that central sulcus as a nice landmark, there are two gyri that we consider. The precentral gyrus, in front of this central sulcus, and the postcentral gyrus, behind that central sulcus. Okay, so the central sulcus separates the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe between the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus. Central sulcus. Those are going to be important when it comes to our functional areas of the cortex. So the cortex is devoted to both motor control in different parts of the body, but also in receiving sensory information coming in, okay, from different parts of the body. And so we call these regions of the cortex, again, the cortex is the outermost gray area, gray matter of the cerebrum, okay, called the cortex. And there we have regions that are devoted to motor commands of certain regions, sending out motor commands to certain areas of the body, or to perceiving sensation or information about sensation coming in from different parts of the body, trying to figure it out, and then deciding if there's going to be a response to that stimuli, that sensation. Bright light, are we going to do some muscle movement and block our eyes? The light is bright when we wake up in the morning, mom turns on that light. First thing we do, right, close, what muscle is that if I close my eyes? It's a bright light, and that's the command that the brain gives me to that stimulus, bright light. Who is that? Oh, Bigularis oculi, thank you so much, yes. So, Brodmann is the fella who kind of mapped out these functional areas of the cortex, figuring out what parts of the cortex are devoted to what? What parts of the cortex are devoted to the foot, the toe, muscle movement there, the arm, the elbow, whatever. What part of the cortex is devoted to understanding sensation coming from different regions of the body. So all of that has been mapped out, and we call these functional areas Brodmann areas. They all have numbers. So again, these functional areas of the cortex are devoted to muscle movement of different regions of the body and to perceiving sensation coming in from different regions of the body. Those motor areas, those functional areas are all about motor, voluntary control of muscles. Okay, so I'm using some functional areas right now to move these muscles. What muscle am I moving? That's right. Sensory areas, right, are devoted to, in the cortex, again, that cortex is the outer gray region of the brain that we can touch. Okay? There's going to be a deeper gray region where we have little regions of gray matter. Okay? And we're going to get to outer cortex, that gray matter. And there we have functional areas that are specifically sensory areas, where we're going to have conscious awareness of sensation coming in from the periphery, okay? From regions of our body at receptors. Receptors for touch, receptors for taste, receptors for temperature, pain. Okay? And then we have association areas that are integrating lots of different information as it's coming in, okay? And as well as commands going out, integrating those things are called association areas. And then each hemisphere of the body, both hemispheres of the brain, of the cortex, is going to be concerned with contralateral sides of the body, opposite sides. The left side is going to be considering what's going on the right side of the body, right? While the right side of the brain is going to be thinking about what's going on and controlling it, trying to understand what's happening to the left side of the body. Contralateral. Okay. So, I'm going to get into some of these functional areas. And understand what they're devoted to, what they're doing. Let's start with the motor areas that we find in the cerebral cortex. All about voluntary control of the muscles in the body. We'll find these motor areas at cortex in the frontal lobe. We're going to see the primary motor cortex, the main cortex of the brain that is devoted to voluntary muscle movement, okay, which is going to be found in that precentral gyrus. We'll see some premotor cortex regions, again in the frontal lobe, cortex regions that are devoted to particular or muscle movements from particular parts of the body. We're going to learn about some other areas here too, and what happens when there's some dysfunction, something happens to those regions. All right, so here we are. This precentral gyrus. We find the primary somatic. We're starting with the body. Somatic, the body. Primary somatic motor cortex. Okay? And body or somatic compared to visceral, the organs. Okay? We're going to see when we head down the brain stem, regions there that are controlling the viscera, the organs. And what kind of muscle do we find in the organs? Smooth muscle, that's right, yes. All right, so here we are. The primary motor cortex at the precentral gyrus. All right. The cerebrum. The precentral gyrus gives Brodmann area number 4. You don't have to worry about those numbers. You just know this has been mapped out and given all kinds of numbers. Okay? Again, in the frontal lobe, again, it's anterior to that central sulcus. So that gyrus in front of that central sulcus, the neurons here in that precentral gyrus, that cortex, that gray matter, where the cell bodies of the neurons are located, are going to direct the voluntary movements of the body by controlling motor neurons that are down in the brain stem and in the spinal cord. So neurons here, and we saw in lab today how neurons, right, will synapse onto other neurons, right? Where the neurons, the incoming axon termini from one neuron will synapse onto another neuron. We saw that when it comes to the same thing but happening at a muscle cell, at the neuromuscular junction. Yes, that neuron synapsed on a muscle cell. Well, in the cortex, in the central nervous system, neurons synapse on other neurons as well, where one neuron secretes neurotransmitter into that synaptic cleft, and that then binds to what? The receptor, now in another neuron, okay, in its plasma membrane. And that's going to cause an electrical impulse to be generated in that neuron. And that's how we pass this information from neuron to neuron, how they communicate with each other, how they control one another. Okay? And so, our precentral gyrus, that cortex, that motor cortex, is allowing our control of muscle movement, skeletal muscle movement, all of those muscles that we just got finished with, depending on the precentral gyrus for movement, for innervation to contract. All right, here we are at the precentral gyrus, the primary somatic motor cortex. Now, one thing that we have done is created the motor homunculus. And the motor homunculus tries to show the amount of cortex that's devoted to the muscle movement from different regions of the body. to controlling muscle movements from different parts of the body. And this homunculus is this upside down caricature that we draw over the precentral gyrus in a way that we show how much of the cortex, the cerebral cortex and the cerebrum, is devoted to innervating muscles from particular regions of the body. And this drawing is distorted. There's going to be some distortion. The larger the structure, like the toe, the big toe is drawn big, that means that cortex, there's a lot of cortex devoted to controlling those muscles in the big toe. If the body's region is drawn small, that tries to indicate that a little bit of cortex is devoted towards the muscle movement in this body area. Okay? So this is the motor homunculus. When we take body regions and we draw them over the cortex, here the precentral gyrus, and we draw them distorted so that big structures, like the thumb, indicates that the cortex here, a lot of it is devoted to muscle movement of the thumb. As compared to the toes, just a little bit of cortex is devoted to muscle movement of the toes. And that is the motor homunculus, where it's been mapped out what region of the cortex is devoted to what body region as far as muscle control and moving those parts of the body. And all of that has been mapped out. Would you want to be the subject in this experiment? All right. Besides the precentral gyrus, where we have the primary motor cortex devoted to the muscle movements from around the body, there's also more cortex in the frontal lobe that's functioning and helping when it comes to muscle movement. The premotor cortex, okay? The cortex devoted to motor control of our muscles, okay? That's even before that precentral gyrus. In front of that, we have some premotor cortex anterior to the precentral gyrus. And the premotor cortex is all there to help us plan our muscle movement, okay? Help us to prepare for some muscle movement. Okay? So it's helping to enhance our muscle movement by giving us the preparation for that movement, okay? And it's especially those movements that are going to be triggered by some external stimuli. Something external is going to trigger some kind of muscle movement. Right? And all of that planning for that muscle movement is happening at the premotor cortex, controlling our voluntary actions that depend upon some sensation, responding to sensation. Okay? This is where we have our learned and repetitious patterned motor skills. Okay? Can you think of something that you do often to where your body has learned that muscle movement, right? That muscle memory. Say that a lot, right? That's at the premotor cortex. So here is premotor cortex, and different regions of it are devoted to different things. For instance, the motor center for walking, okay, and the coordination of this muscle movement, right? The control of muscle in order to walk. This cortex is devoted to that. This region of the cortex, again, the cortex, all of this outer gray matter. And this is where we find the cell bodies of neurons that are devoted to controlling our muscle, planning for the muscle movement necessary for walking, for riding. Those of you taking notes, who's using their cortex, their premotor cortex for riding right now? Who's taking notes? That's what I'm asking. That's what I'm asking. Okay. For gazing, right? When we're looking for gazing. Some other special regions we have here. Broca's area, we're going to talk about it. Wernicke's area for speech, we're going to talk about those. They're pretty interesting. Broca's area is controlling our muscles when it comes to speech. Okay? This is the motor speech area. The cortex devoted to the muscle control necessary for speech, for talking. Okay? We find it usually in the left hemisphere of the brain. And again, this is the cortex that is directing the muscles that are devoted to speech and producing speech. All of that voluntary motor control of our muscles that are necessary for talking. When someone has some type of dysfunction in this area, or there was an injury that damaged Broca's area, he gets a special name, Broca's area. That person can suffer from what's called Broca's aphasia. And Broca's aphasia is the impairment of speech due to injury at Broca's area, at that region of the premotor cortex. Okay? And here we have impairment at the tongue, the muscles of the tongue, okay? The vocal folds, which are our vocal cords that we'll get to, the jaw, the lips, the muscles that we study that are controlling the movement of the mandible, for speaking. Okay? The injury leads to the inability for voluntary control, okay? And the inability for correct patterning when it comes to forming words. Okay? People who suffer from Broca's aphasia, they know what they want to say. There's nothing wrong there. They know what they want to say, but they can't say it because of the loss of motor control for speech. They can't get it out. When they try to speak, they have this, the words and the sentences aren't coming out right, okay? Even though they can understand words and sentences, when they talk, you can't understand them well, okay? So they have agrammatic speech. It's not grammatically correct, okay? They can't repeat things. They have poor repetition, but they can understand what they hear.
Is that like the stuttering?
Well, you see people trying to get their words out, but it's not stuttering. That's different. So this is, it might look like stuttering, but it's them not being able to have, or having good motor control of those muscles, okay? Because of this dysfunction in Broca's area. So let's see if we can see what that looks like. Hopefully the sound is hooked up and you can hear this.
What's this?
Now tell me what this thing was with your legs last week or week before.
No good.
Let's make it so you can see it. Tell us what he wants to say.
Age
Can't get it out
And-
right.
uh,
Imagine how
Knees.
frustrating it would be.
Well, they can't come
and
out.
ankles.
Trying to get it out.
What'd you do about it?
Home, doctor, and legs.
No good, huh? Man, you're a fellow who likes to walk, too.
Oh, geez.
Huh?
Oh, boy, oh, boy.
And it's getting too cold
Yeah?
to run your John Deere tractor, isn't it?
Yeah.
Another example. Sorry, these are all back in the day. But interesting.
And stool, is it a boy, is it landing down? The girl is laughing, and cookie jar,
So it's agrammatical. It doesn't make, grammatically, it doesn't make sense.
window, curtains, and out the garden, and trees, low grass, and lake.
So those are examples of growth as a phase.
That's what I do, bro. That's what I do. All I do.
While we're talking,
Takes
was
4
that,
hours.
would
That's
they
what I
write
do, 2
like
hours.
that?
I need 2 hours.
So the writing isn't disturbing. It's just the vocalization of what they want to say. Yeah.
Trying to explain.
Trying to explain, right, they can understand, they know what they wanna say, they just can't get it out right, because of damage to the area of the cortex that controls the muscles necessary for speech.
So here's working, but the mouth is not.
Well, the brain isn't working
The brain.
in that area, there's some injury that causes dysfunction, that's then causing that dysfunction at the muscles, yeah, that are allowed to speak. It has to be some injury there damaging those neurons. Something damaging the neurons or whatever, it could be. Right, right, stroke, right?
Injury with a car accident?
Yeah, car accident,
Is it always showing up in the when you see what they were saying like the primary words, but they were saying like that was right?
so I think those are good examples of what it looks like. You know, you can see that they can say some words they okay, right? But when they're not fluent sentences.
But it's
Right.
weird that they can write it out.
Because those muscles aren't damaged. And the neurons controlling writing, muscles for writing, those aren't what are damaged.
Maybe so they can put it in the.
So besides Broca's area, there's also Wernicke's area. So Broca's area is here, actually in the premotor cortex. We find Wernicke's area in some association cortex, so an association area that's actually in the temporal lobe, okay? And it's involved in understanding written and spoken language. Now, there's some damage in the region of the cortex necessary to understand what we're reading and understand what's being said. And when there's damage in that area, Wernicke's area, there's Wernicke's aphasia. Here, we have an impairment in language comprehension. So it's not being able to speak well, and the damage is in the muscles necessary for fluent speech and grammatic speech. The problem is now at understanding language, okay? So language is meaningless, okay, when there's damage to this particular region of the cortex, Wernicke's area, okay? You still get speech, it's not the muscles controlling speech, it's not Broca's area, okay? So speech sounds natural, okay? As long as Broca's area isn't damaged as well. Now, both are damaged, then there is, speech isn't natural, so we saw what that looks like, but also there will be an impairment in understanding language. But as long as Broca's area is intact, then a patient would retain the ability to, speak well and, sounding natural, but still would have an impairment in comprehending language. Here, we would see this as fluent speech, just as long as Broca's areas are okay, not being able to process what they're hearing well, okay? And also not being able to repeat what is being said to them. So they don't have a good understanding of what is being said. They have these extended sentences that don't make sense. They make up words. And they jumble words. So instead of saying the ball rolled down the street, it'll be the street rolled down the ball. Okay. See what that looks like.
Steve, thank you right there. End of the football.
End of the football?
Is it influence the football right here? The cause that it comes in, see?
Yeah.
The end of it, see? Yeah. Oh, we have other things, see?
I don't understand.
Well, it's pliable into the other, see? You don't understand it, but it applies in the long thread reed comes from there. And it comes source from the country out here, see? All the under it, see, it comes up and finally come out here and goes out, see? Get it?
Sort of.
Yeah, it comes out here, see, it comes out here, and here, and it comes in, and it comes out, and bing. That's a good fly throw, see?
That's a good what?
And that's a good flow those sliders, see, it flows cold or gives or kicks out or bing or whatever it is. We has no football.
See, one more last example of wording.
Thanks. And say, baseball player, caterpillar, okay. All right, I'd like for you to do some things now with your mouth. First thing I'd like for you to do is stick out your tongue. Stick your tongue? Show me how you would kiss. Show me how you love to kiss me. Show me how you sit on a straw. Can you sip on a straw?
That's wording euthanasia. Again, damage to the cortex, the association area, that is Wernicke's area, okay, in the temporal lobe. Well, we know now, at the cortex, besides cortex devoted to motor control, voluntary muscle movement, we also have cortex that is devoted to being aware of sensation that's coming in from the PNS, the peripheral nervous system, and all of our receptors there for sensation, okay? And all that coming in, being brought in to via neurons, bringing that sensation in, whose receptors are out in the periphery. All of that information travels as electrical impulses, okay, up neurons into the central nervous system. It's passed into the central nervous system, okay? And at different levels of the spinal cord, that's the information about sensation. At whatever level we're talking about, so at my fingertips, that information will travel along the axons of neurons into the spinal cord. Now we're from the periphery nervous system into the central nervous system. And then that information will travel up to the brain, where it will be perceived, okay? And the brain will decide what to do in response to that sensation. Now, if it's a reflex, and we need to quickly respond to something, okay? That information, that is handled at the spinal cord. We'll get to that. We don't spend time going up to the brain. We have to quickly do a reflex, okay? But if we need to head up to the brain, it will be sent, the brain will perceive it, understand it, figure it out, and then respond to it, okay? So we have cortex there at the brain that's devoted to being consciously aware of the sensation that's being brought in, okay? And we're gonna find the sensory areas of the cortex in our other lobes, in the parietal lobe, in the insula, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. And we have different regions of the cortex. We're gonna see the primary somatosensory cortex. Okay, primary cortex there, devoted to sensation from the body, somatosensory. Okay. We'll also see the vestibular cortex. Okay, it's all about us keeping our balance. Okay, we'll see the auditory areas. Okay, we'll see the visual areas, the areas for taste, the gustatory areas, the areas for smell, the olfactory areas, the areas that are devoted to sensation coming in from our organs. Okay, you ever feel heartburn? That's our esophagus. Burning from our gastric juices from the stomach going up to the esophagus. We call it heartburn. It's our esophagus, actually. All right. The post-central gyrus. Now we're looking at that gyrus, that raised region of cortex that's behind the central sulcus. Okay? So that pre-central gyrus in front of the central sulcus, primary motor control. That post-central gyrus after the central gyrus is the primary somatosensory cortex, sensory from the body, somatic. Okay? And it is in the parietal lobe. Here, neurons are receiving somatic sensory information for touch, pressure, pain, temperature, taste, as well as spatial discrimination, being able to figure out what body of the region is being stimulated. Okay, if I can feel a bug on my arm, and I know there's a bug on my arm, and I can feel it, right? All right, so here we are. Now we're in the post-central gyrus, where we have the cortex, the primary cortex, devoted to receiving and understanding sensation coming in from the body. And post-central gyrus, this cortex. We have a homunculus that demonstrates the amount of cortex that is devoted to contralateral sensory input. What's coming in from sensation at the left side of the body is going to be perceived on the right side of the brain, and vice versa. Okay? Contralateral sensory input from body regions. Again, we use this homunculus to show how much cerebral cortex is devoted, okay, to understanding sensation coming in from different parts of the body. So we lay the homunculus out according to a lot of experiments that were done in figuring out how much cortex is devoted to sensation of the nose. A lot. The nose, the lips. There's a lot of cortex devoted to sensation coming in from the lips, the tongue, right? As compared to the toes. The homunculus tries to give us a depiction of how much cortex is devoted to understanding and perceiving sensation coming in. And then we have cortex around the cerebrum that is devoted to somatosensory information and understanding it. Okay? The sensory fields for taking action, okay? Understanding sensation that's going to lead to us taking some type of action. Object tactile recognition without even looking. I can touch this and I can find it. I can touch it and I know, okay, that's a marker. Okay? Now you're looking at our primary gustatory center for our taste, our auditory cortex, for our hearing, right? So this is just a bit of the regions of the cortex devoted to sensation coming in and understanding it. So this is where Wernicke's area is. Below it is a region of the cortex devoted to hearing. So we have a primary, secondary, and tertiary regions of the brain, cortex, devoted to hearing and perceiving that sensation. And here's where you find the tertiary auditory cortex and the temporal lobe. We then open up the brain and look into the hemisphere underneath. We'll find on the inner side of the temporal lobe, right, the primary auditory cortex. All of these regions devoted to understanding what we are perceiving as far as auditory information. We kind of look at the region, if we pull, let's see how, if we take this part of the model away and you look at the top of this, superior portion of this part of the model, will look down onto the secondary auditory cortex. There's that primary auditory cortex. So all of this was mapped out to understand what regions of the cortex are devoted to what the different sensations and perceiving and understanding them. In the occipital lobe, we have a deep buried within the occipital lobe. We have the primary visual cortex, okay? And then we have our tertiary, the very backside of the occipital lobe, we'll find our secondary and our tertiary cortex. Any questions about that so far? Okay. So next, we're going to take a look at,
Okay, home break.
does it? Too much in there?
Yeah, too much input.
Too much input, too much sensory input.
Let's see, right? See it.
All right, so next we're gonna head down into the cerebellum
Just do it.
and understand that region of the brain that is right below and posterior to the cerebellum. So in lab today, you're gonna get opportunity to take a look at these different regions of the brain and see them in relation to each other, and understand their positioning in relation to each other, and then also understanding the different regions of these structures that we're gonna have to remember and understand and be able to identify. And always remember that we want to always find, prepare a small description of a particular region's function. Okay, so prepare for that as you are studying. Make sure that you're continuously preparing a small statement about a particular function of a particular body region. Okay? So let's head into the cerebellum. Where we are Yeah, this is the region of the brain that is posterior and inferior to the cerebrum. The cerebellum is going to receive input coming in from the cortex of the cerebrum. So the cerebrum, the part of the brain that we associate with what the brain looks like, right? With all the gyri and the soli. And then the cerebellum, the region that's posterior and inferior to the cerebrum. Here, at the cerebellum, we're gonna receive input coming in from the cortex of the cerebrum and coming up from the brainstem. So we have sensory receptors also delivering information here to the cerebellum as well. So it receives information that helps us to initiate voluntary muscle contraction, okay? It receives information about body position, as well as how fast we're moving, momentum, okay? Even up and down in an elevator, okay? That type of body movement. It's going to make any adjustments to and for motor activity, okay? According to our muscle memory and learn patterns, as well as what we are sensing. So, the cerebellum is going to calculate the best way to coordinate all our muscle control, our muscle contractions, so that those movements are nice and smooth. In response to stimuli, again, the cerebellum is below the cerebral. Okay, it is behind or dorsal to the part of the brainstem that we're going to get to. These parts are the pons of the medulla, so the regions of the brainstem. It has a right and left hemisphere as well, just like the cerebrum. Separating the right and left hemispheres is what we call the vermis. Vermis means worm, so it looks like a worm, so someone named it, called it the vermis. I'm an anatomist. It has anterior and posterior lobes. We saw those in lab today. And then it also has these additional lobes called the flocculonodular lobes. Okay? And it has in it the organization of white matter. So axons of neurons. Neurons are here. Okay? And their axons make this beautiful patterning that's called the arbor V, which means the tree of life. So here we are at the cerebellum. Again, inferior to the cerebrum, is receiving input coming from the cerebrum and receiving input coming up the brainstem. Delivering information, receiving information about sensation that's coming up the brainstem as well, being delivered to the cerebellum. Now it's going to help to coordinate muscle movement, okay, in response to sensation coming in. Again, we have a region of the cerebellum called the vermis that helps to connect the right and left hemispheres of the cerebellum. At its lobes, and it has anterior lobes and posterior lobes. This is where we're planning for muscle movement. We're coordinating our muscle movement, okay? So that we have smooth, voluntary muscle movement. The gyri here look different. Do they not? See the gyri here compared to the gyri here? The raised regions here, we call them fovea. The gyri are called fovea. So those are gyri that are running transversely, nice and horizontally. We have these small little lobes called the flocculonodular lobe, and you will not get marked for spelling. Don't worry about that. And these are involved in balance and the eye movements that we make according to those those eye muscles, those extraocular muscles attached to those eyeballs. All right, lateral rectus moves. What does lateral rectus do? This is on the test. Move one eyeball. Who put one eyeball? One eyeball laterally. Which way does the other muscle or eye move? Medially. Good job. Good job. That arbor V is this pattern, this tree-like pattern that the white matter in the cerebellum makes. Okay, so here we are at the cerebellum. Let me take a posterior look. There's the cerebellum. We do a nice section through the brain. Right? Nice mid-sagittal section. Open it up, we can see the cerebellum, and you can start to see how the white matter forms this tree-like structure. Taking this anterior view, looking at the brain, there's the frontal lobe of the cerebrum, there are the temporal lobes. We're gonna head down the brainstem soon enough, but right here, we're back here at the cerebellum. It's right and left hemisphere. Okay? It also has an anterior and posterior lobe. Anterior and posterior lobe. The right and left hemispheres are separated by this transversely running region of axons that are running transversely, connecting the right and left hemispheres. This region is called the vermis. Connects the right and left hemisphere, allowing communication between the right and left hemispheres of the cerebellum. On our model, we can take it apart, look at different parts of it. This is the cerebellum. And we're looking at the top surface of it that will be in contact with the cerebrum above it. In the brain, we can see here, here's a flocculo-nodular lobe. And there's another flocculo-nodular lobe in the cerebellum. And again, this is the brain stem. That on a model, here is a flocculo-nodular lobe. Again. Here is the vermis, the actual cerebellum, separating the right and left hemispheres of the cerebellum. On the model, we can see it better depicted, the vermis, where we have axons of neurons running transversely, connecting and allowing communication between the right and left hemispheres of the cerebellum. And here's that arbor V, a tree of life that looks like a tree, and that is the white matter organization in the cerebellum. Again, white matter are the axons of neurons running, and their cell bodies are in the gray matter surrounding that arbor V. In the actual cerebellum. Okay. Are there any questions? Somebody give me a question. So, our test scores posted? Any questions? Yes. Yeah. To your lecture.
Okay, yeah.
Lecture exam.